You know something, one of the key features that I observed significant changes in that gave me real confidence that I was on the right pathway when it came to actually achieving long-term recovery from my chronic condition was a shift in my personality, where I started to regain some of the characteristics that had been absent from my life for well over a decade. The thing is, many people will have you believe that making a conscious effort to alter your personality is enough in itself to bring you out of a chronically symptomatic state from a long-standing autonomic or autoimmune condition. However, I don't know about you, but this approach just never worked for me. And that's because my body would just continue to bounce back into being symptomatic. And I think that highlights a really important point that I want to take into this video. And that's that so much of our personality is determined by the physical constraints that our body currently has in place. I'm a big believer that our physiology is influencing our personality far more than our personality influences our physiology. And yes, in certain acute circumstances, we can play a role over how our body feels. However, chronically, there's only so much positive thinking that we can do before our symptoms eventually get the better of us. Just before I discuss what I really want to talk about in this video, of course it goes without saying that if you've experienced immense trauma as a result of your chronic condition, then that's no real surprise as to why that would directly affect your personality. Similarly to if you were to be living with something where you had to precariously plan your day around it, and it always occupied some headspace in the back of your mind, a little bit like how a diabetic regularly has to check in on their blood sugar levels. But these are unfortunately unavoidable things that people have to just learn how best to live with, and maybe that requires some additional support like counselling or therapy. However, what I really want to discuss in this video specifically is how certain dysfunctions in neuronal networks can then go on to lead to major changes in our personality, and what we can actually do to start to reverse these changes. Okay, so I don't know about you, but something that I observe time and time again in the chronic illness community, and it's something that I myself was living with for a number of years, is a very monotone and expressionless personality. It's almost as if you're operating day to day with a very narrow bandwidth of emotions. Do you ever feel like this, where when you interact with people, you can never comfortably express the likes of enthusiasm, joy, laughter, or excitement without feeling some kind of physical resistance deep down within your body? Or maybe you do attempt to express these emotions, but later on in the day or the following day, your body crashes and you're hit with an intense range of symptoms that leaves you housebound for a period of time. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to positive emotions. There might have been a certain circumstance where you felt an intense desire to express the likes of rage or anger, and instead of actually projecting that emotion, instead what you decided to do was to stuff it down. So why is this happening to us, where we feel as though we're being cornered into living a virtually expressionless existence, whilst there are tons of people out there who appear to have bags of energy and are visibly very animated with their expressions? Well, I strongly believe that what plays the largest part in determining whether people find themselves in one category or the other is the functional integrity of certain neuronal circuitry that exists within the body. If something has happened to you as an individual that has caused regions of your nervous system to start to function suboptimally, then ongoing repeated patterns of dysfunction will apply a stressor to your body that won't be present in the body of fit and healthy people. And subsequently, daily and often menial activities that you partake in will drain your energy reserves and exhaust your body's resources far quicker than in these other people. And the reason for that is because your body will be forced into making so many internal adaptations that theirs won't have to in order to perform the same basic tasks. And the reason as to why this has such a big tie to personality is because when it comes to these expressions, whether that be joy, excitement, enthusiasm, or laughter, these expressions all require more energy expenditure than simply remaining in a neutral and relatively expressionless state. And for a body that's struggling with its energy levels, it will always unconsciously opt to be in the most energy-preserving state possible. Another big factor that heavily influences the personalities and range of expressions that those with a chronic autonomic or autoimmune condition often portray is when there are neuronal dysfunctions present that contribute to alterations in the unconscious respiratory centers within our brain that are responsible for mediating our unconscious breathing rate. This rhythm is set in our brainstem, and in particular by part of the brain called the medulla, and sat just above the medulla is a part of the brain called the pons that, if not kept in check, has the potential of adversely impacting the medulla and thus speeding up our unconscious respiratory rate. When this occurs, it's clinically very significant, as changes to our breathing patterns can then go on to impact variables like pH levels or carbon dioxide levels within our blood, which then in turn can impact our respiratory system, our circulatory system, our digestive system, and in turn that can go on to lead to a whole host of issues occurring throughout the body. So how is all of this related to personality and our ability to express a range of expressions? Well, if you really start to think about it, talking and just being more sociable in general is a more complex form of breathing. Add into that extended periods of laughter or enthusiasm or joy, and all of a sudden, without realizing it, you've completely thrown your unconscious respiratory rate out of sync, and what can follow is a whole range of undesirable symptoms. You understandably might not be aware of any of this. However, what you might be far more aware of is just how careful you are to preserve your emotional state during interactions with people, and that in itself can be a very telling sign that your body is unconsciously holding you back in order to preserve the internal state of its chemistry. The third thing that I want to bring up, and I'm going to tie all of these three things together in just a moment, is the fact that if neurological damage has occurred that impairs your brain's ability to actually decode its surrounding environment, then certain higher centers are going to have a hard time keeping check over more primal survival mechanisms that are operating just beneath them. How this is supposed to work is that your brain takes on board and processes multiple sources of input from its surrounding environment. And if this information that comes into the brain is accurate and actually aligns with reality, then your brain, knowing where your body is relative to the world around it, will then in turn allow your brain to remain calm. This works because our cortex, which are these two large hemispheres at the top of our brain, project to the part of the brain just beneath it, called the basal ganglia, and then that signals to produce inhibitory neurotransmitters, which suppress and calm down the hyperactivity of the midbrain, which sits just beneath it. However, all of this happening is completely contingent upon the cortex continually receiving accurate sensory information from its surrounding environment. Failure of that happening will result in a breakdown in this series of events, allowing the midbrain's hyperactivity to take over, and subsequently that will end up leading to heightened autonomic activity throughout the entire body. And the reason why this all links so intimately in with personality is because you try being calm, rational, or enthusiastic whilst you have severe shortness of breath, a racing heartbeat, or gut spasming. It's virtually impossible. What I'm ultimately getting at is that there's a physiological state that your body needs to be in before it grants you permission to actually express a whole range of emotions. And this is one of the key reasons as to why so many people with a chronic condition end up becoming introverted and relatively apathetic. Without them knowing it, the internal state of their body is subtly communicating to them to rein in their expressions in order to then allow the body to fulfill more important physiological tasks with the resources that it has available to it. But if you would like to learn far more about all of this, head on over to the Unbeatable Blueprint online course. This is where I discuss the origin behind many of these nervous system disorders, and more importantly, what you can do yourself to start to gradually turn the recovery dial in your favour. So the 3 things I've discussed in this video: breakdowns in neuronal pathways leading to adaptations and thus increased energy expenditure, alterations to the unconscious respiratory rate that occurs within the brain, and also a lack of inhibition coming down from the brain in order to calm down the body's autonomic activity. These 3 things all contribute so heavily to shaping our personality and how we actually go about expressing ourselves on a day-to-day basis. However, the good news is that there's a significant link between all 3 that could offer us a possible lifeline of actually being able to counter this situation. And what that link is, and it's something that I alluded to earlier on in the video, is that all of these 3 things can be impacted both positively and negatively by the sensory information that our body continuously receives from its external environment. If the peripheral receptors that are responsible for detecting this information were to be fine-tuned, meaning that they were working up to scratch and working how our evolution designed them to work, that would mean that our brain would be able to accurately interpret all the sensory cues that existed in the world around it. And the knock-on effects of this would be less energy expenditure occurring internally because neuronal networks would be communicating more efficiently. We would have more inhibitory firing coming down from the cortex, which would calm autonomic activity of our body. And this would also include calming down our unconscious respiratory rate. And subsequently, as a result of being far more relaxed and feeling far less on edge, we'd have far more energy interacting with others and being able to express ourselves. And on top of this, we'd have far more confidence venturing further and further outside of our comfort zone, knowing that we'd be able to trust our body in the process. And you would probably agree that having a more relaxed and energized body would end up having a positive spin on your all-round personality, where you could be far more expressive and extroverted without having to worry about suffering such severe symptomatic consequences. Whereas on the flip side, if something had happened to you that had impacted the functional integrity of these receptors, so for example, you'd experienced a concussion, an infection, a traumatic event, or damage caused as a result of a particular substance, then the opposite effects would occur. This will lead to a brain that struggles to process sensory stimuli from its surrounding environment, and as a result it will have to work so much harder and expel so much more energy just to unconsciously decode these variables, and it will end up leaving you feeling overwhelmed and exhausted, especially in environments where there is perhaps more going on. And this is why the more dysregulated your nervous system becomes, the more introverted and withdrawn you're forced into being. It's not inherently that you have these personality traits deep within you. It's more the fact that your body is overriding you in order to protect itself. So with all of that being said, what can we ourselves do to start to work towards reclaiming our old personality back from our chronic condition? Well, what it ultimately involves is being able to identify and address any underlying dysfunction that exists within these neuronal systems. Once you've identified the area of the problem, you can then use very targeted neurological exercises to promote neuroplasticity, and that will enhance the functional integrity of your nervous system so that it's able to operate far more efficiently and be far more resilient to the stressors of everyday life. Once you start to take the pressure off of this system by getting it to function more in line with how it was originally designed to function, that is the precise moment where you'll start to notice remnants of your old personality gradually begin to return. However, I must stress, this isn't an overnight fix, and these changes do take time to occur. Now, the professional who was able to help me to achieve this was a board-certified chiropractic neurologist who ran multiple diagnostic tests, and the purpose of these tests was to identify any abnormal outputs or effects that were being produced by my brain, and these would be key indicators to pinpoint the exact area of my nervous system that wasn't functioning optimally. Having in-depth knowledge of these neuronal systems, the practitioner was then able to follow the corresponding pathway further upstream in order to find out which sensory receptor was behaving dysfunctionally and thus leading to that abnormal output being produced. With this information, he then got me started on some very targeted neurological exercises, and the purpose of these was to basically strengthen any weak links that were identified within this pathway, and that then in turn would allow more coordinated sensory information to be brought into my brain on a consistent basis, which would then in turn balance out chemical and hormonal levels throughout my body. When all of this happened, it took so many ongoing pressures off of my body that it allowed my body to start to relax at an unconscious level, and that then in turn allowed me to start to notice glimpses of my old personality gradually begin to resurface.